Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Polish warfare from the 11th to the 14th century for our regional history of warfare as an introduction to the, heart of medieval Polish warfare. I already made multiple videos about medieval Polish warfare as a matter of fact, but as I often say, these introductions are always useful to frame the broader picture as a whole, where you can eventually contextualize the information on the various, armies, organization, battles, tactics, unit types, and so on. So it's important, first of all, to give a look at Poland from a political, territorial point of view, and then looking also at the distinctive traits of the Polish military culture as such. But you know that these introductions are also aimed at showing how not just these military cultures somehow overlapped to some degree. First of all, how similar really they were, especially within the sanitary contexts, and differentiating it from the nomadic one. But also how you can, of course, you cannot fully distinguish, in fact, these influences from the actual needs of these of the same local warfare, so that you can't quite simply label certain styles or types of weapons, sort of in a broader sense that very often goes beyond even the same national basis. Now, Great Poland, that is around Poznan, and Little Poland around Krakow to the southeast, the Polish political territorial heartland already by the end of the 10th century. The Poles had fundamentally emerged hegemonically from this Western Slavic tribal background, subduing other peoples in the region and managing to, in fact, found a proper dynastic state during the high Middle Ages. Of course, at the beginning of this period, everything was very floating and unstable, but the permanence, after all, of the Polish principality and kingdom historically is a testament to the solidity of this, in fact, otherwise turbulent and unstable system that, also fragmented or compacted throughout the Middle Ages and had, in fact, such tormented history. But even more because of that, this is quite remarkable. Mazovia, northeast of Warsaw, Silesia to the southwest, and Lusatia in what is today's eastern Germany, were all essentially brought under the Polish authority in the early 11th century. I've never made a video talking about the very beginning, of Polish power. I made something perhaps generic, but the way the Piasts managed to affirm this power is something we will have to deal with in detail. Evidently, there was an imperial dimension that was similar in many ways. I made a video specifically on this to the Rusian one, but it surely was imitating also the Eastern Frankish models, not just because Poland would, from this point onwards, mostly be influenced by the Holy Roman Empire as the major, cultural and also military influence, but also because that elective and dynastic model of power was fundamentally shared in the region by different polities that were emerging, such as even the Czechs, even if they were smaller, but gradually compacting in a world that otherwise had never seen a statile reality, nor true urbanization, and that was just difficult to control because of population sparsity, lack of communications, etc., to an important degree. This had been the problem, it had been the limit of the same Western Empire in the East. Everything was also shaded, that Germany doesn't quite have a defined eastern boundary. In fact, in the following century, the same Poland, part of what was occupied initially by the Piasts, was also in part Germanized, and we'll see it better now, also from a military point of view. But it was a composite picture, and the way the Poles emerged in this sort of, in fact, imperial dimension, of course, is as ambitious as, however, well rooted in a true military power. In the northwest, you have Pomerania on the Baltic coast that was occupied by the Piests for a while, before, however, falling under German domination. We will talk about Pomerania in some regional history series. Briefly, the area of Bohemia and Moravia that was witnessing, as we just recalled, a similar pattern under the Przemyslids, but continuing towards the east, parts, in fact, of what is, let's say, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and then further east, even what is today's Ukraine, were falling under Piast control at some point. The Piast at some point intervened, even in fact in the Kievan Rus, civil struggles, etc. By the beginning of the 12th century, as a consequence, we can assess how Poland, interestingly enough, occupied much the same territory as it does today. You know, that later on, in the Middle Ages and the modern era, and part even of the contemporary one, what we what we call Poland is shifted much more east compared to the today's boundaries. But these were actually, to an important degree, the same, more or less the same, ones at the beginning of the 12th century, before great part of the German colonization towards the east and so on. This is true with the exception, however, of Pomerania on the Baltic coast, and also the southern Prussian lands in the northeast. The reason why the latter lands remain excluded lays in the fact that most of this region, that as we've seen was not just populated by Western Slavs but also by the Balts, were too poor to establish a concentrated power, so that you could, of course, raid, plunder, etc. The local population couldn't really do much. There would be constant guerrilla. That is a strong form of war, but in the end shows you how, without resources and investment support, also these areas are destined to remain peripheral, not developing a competitive power in the first place, right? And this was a serious problem in the north, especially because Poland, in this sense, could not have an access to the Baltic Sea. That would be stripped, in fact, from them by the Germans. Later on, Germans, however, that the same Poles had called to fight against these pagan populations. Now, the aforementioned frontiers as a whole, right, around the Polish principality remained relatively unchanged, albeit Lusatia and Silesia would be essentially lost to the Holy Roman Empire, of which Poland was not a part, unlike a Bohemian crown that was absorbed later on, and this state of affairs was settled by the 13th century, when, as we will see, lots of things changed just in state building and in also external influences in that capacity of concentrating power, paradoxically through a feudal glue of some Western model. Such losses, let's say, in the north and in the west, were partially compensated instead by the eastern gains. And largely, as we will see, because the Mongols, as you know, had broken the Rusian power, and so not just Poland, but initially Lithuania had profited of this. In the 40s of the 14th century, we see that Ruthenia and Galicia were acquired from, in fact, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that was trying to grab as much land as possible in order to fuel its struggle against the Teutonic Knights in the north. A lost struggle, by the way. Lithuania was saved solely by the fact that it united with Poland, that also mastered fundamentally Lithuania, or at least was fundamentally the bigger power against which the latter could not really do much. And so in the later Middle Ages, we have seen it in different videos I made about 14th and 15th century Poland. The latter's royal power began to expand substantially towards the southeast, towards the Black Sea, and consolidating, in fact, a trend that would make Poland this, in fact, from the square sort of contemporary borders, as we've seen, were roughly overlapping with the 12th century ones, to a more oblong, stretched rhomboid that, in fact, followed around that axis, right, the northwestern, southeastern one. Naturally, this implicated a lot of relations with the Rus that will be observed in later in the equipment, but also in the video. I can't tell you because I scheduled it already about the same the equivalent of this one for Russian warfare as well. That will happen in a while, but it's interesting to have it. And I already made videos about the Rus, Ukrainian history, just Galicia, Volhynia, etc. throughout different periods of the Middle Ages, modern age, and the contemporary one. So during all this period, which was incredibly complicated, you have initially a strong Piast power in initial times, then breaking down into different duchies that were not recomposed until a couple of centuries later. So I will not digress on this because we'll just look at the military side of the story. Just keep that in mind, however, and check my other videos on Polish history because I covered them with some degree of depth already. Let's look at the military landscape. So it can be said that northwestern Slavs appeared to have had a few cavalry, right? If you look, I made a video about, I think, the Polish army organization or something, or even talking just about Polish infantry during the same period, in which we observed how actually the Poles, specifically, were at the center of today's Poland in this regard. By developing this imperial tendencies, actually had a remarkable amount of mounted forces, even up to 1/3, which is a lot. Naturally, this means that most of these troops were actually lighter. They had, you see how they were tendentially similar towards to the Rus, then going further east, even to the steppes to some degree. The Westerners were instead about, say, less but heavier cavalry on average. So this is somehow normal. And part of the reason having to do with some open plains, even though Poland was also covered in an important degree of forests, it was not, let's say, fully wide and open, cleared, reclaimed, and so on. It's obvious, we will see it quite clearly that peoples like the Slavic tribes such as the Wends, the Wilces, the Obodrites that we'll have to discuss in detail at some point, were definitely and largely infantry based. I made a video about multiple videos about the Ottonian expedition against the Western Slavs, and they're mostly these peoples, and we've seen how they had definitely less infantry than even the Saxons at that point. That were not particularly yes, they had a solid equestrian culture, and even the Slavs definitely had that too, but not in that great abundance of heavy cavalry in the first place. The Poles, however, had, again, as an ethnic group, more cavalry than these other ones, right? And because of their hegemonic role, they were moderately better armed than them as well. Poland was not definitely a particularly advanced, developed, or prosper country compared to, say, I don't know, the Western Europe, the Mediterranean, etc. So they fought with what they had. We would be struck by the degree of primitiveness and wildness by a degree. But still, of course, there was also in Poland an acceleration in the process of feudal, in the formation of feudal society, the developing of chivalric ideals along that more dynastic pattern rather than the tribal one that had been existing before. So this is a very important moment of coalescence, right, of the Polish establishment that remained out of the Holy Roman Empire at large, right? It managed to maintain is mostly due to this quite intricate and difficult and dangerous, situation within itself to that sort of independence. This applies to many countries in Europe at some point. Now, by the early 12th century, the coastal Slavs possessed war fleets which raided as far as Norway. Especially the Pomeranians had a lot of pirates and sort of seafaring abilities that they had refined during the same Viking year, where many Vikings were actually of Slavic background, and they had also developed an effective light cavalry, similar to the one used by the Prussians and the Lithuanians. The Poles had again stronger cavalry than them, but hit-and-run tactics, especially in this again sort of wilderness, were quite effective at a point against the heavies that the Poles were increasingly needing in order to dominate on the larger range, but also falling at some point in ambushes and retaliations, getting engulfed into counterinsurgency operations, was really relentless, and that at some point was not able to dislodge these peoples. That's how the Teutonic Knights were settled in Prussia, right, as Polish vassals, right, because Polish monarchs had not been able to dislodge them, including the Lithuanians, that were actually early rivals of the Poles in spite of the later union, etc. As a consequence, by the early 13th century, the Slavic princes of what are today's the Baltic coastal provinces of Germany were Christian members of a German warrior aristocracy, right? You know that up to fairly late in time, the divide between the Germans and the Slavs roughly was the Elbe River, right? At this point, the Germans had instead colonized, pushed these peoples away and or integrated, subjugated them. And of course, the local elites are Germanized. This is to be seen even in very late medieval times with evidently Slavic names that were just Germanized for the sake of, say, homogeneity in the feudal hierarchy and institutions. And it's somehow ironic that this same Germanized Slavs would join the Northern Crusade against their pagan neighbors that they had been practically very similar to up to a few generations before, and because of the Germanization of arms and armor, fighting in typically Western European style of arms and armor. This is particularly important, and as we will see, and famously enough, the Piasts of Silesia would be, in fact, indistinguishable in their finest equipment. Then at the lower levels, something more ethnic was present from, in fact, German knights. Very briefly, we note two things. First of all, as indicators of what can be Slav, what can be German, and more specifically Polish, we see during the 11th to 12th century of the development of a typical Polish and Western Slavic war axe that differed, as we will see later, significantly from the Danish type. And sometimes, of course, it's difficult to really distinguish axes for what they really were, but as we will see, there was probably a steppe influence in the shape of these blades. We have also an early Germanic influence on these lands, not just because of the German colonization, but also the Scandinavian contacts that had naturally already been existing from quite a while during the Viking era. We have a sword from Czersko-Polskie, in Bigot's Kujawia that was unfortunately lost during the Second World War. This dates to the 11th century, and it may have well been a Polish, but also Pomeranian or even Prussian weapon. And what we think is that the blade specifically was a German import, but when we look at the pommel and the quillon, we realize that they were more poorly made in horn, right, and imitating through the carving the metal sword mounts made in the more western areas. And so we can think that at least that this would have been practiced even in other, I mean, this could have happened everywhere in Europe, but of course the fact that statistically we have more evidence of this in this context make us think, yeah, this was a way to save on, say, metallurgical expenses and so on. We have also a very difficult sword to date chronologically, because it can be from the late 11th to even up to the early 14th century. Remember that these areas are quite primitive, materially speaking, and so were also parts of Scandinavia. The more north and the more east you go, the more that is the case, right? If you look at even just, we will see it, the influence, Western influence on Bohemia, just because it was closer to civilization. Well, there is an important divide even with the neighboring Poland, that at some point, as we've had seen the Piasts even interfering in Bohemian affairs, etc. This sword is preserved in Płock in Mazovia, so today's northeastern Poland, the region of Warsaw, basically, and it is preserved at the local diocesan museum. And here we see similar dynamic, because the pommel and the quillon of this sword are look fairly late, but the blade seems early. So here there is an inverse dynamic in which the weapon simply was re-hilted, right? It may indicate the fact that the area had a small domestic arm industry, so they had to salvage the most precious parts, such as the blade, and remounting more updated pommels. This it's still possibly not a Polish weapon, but a Pomeranian, Prussian, or Lithuanian one, because it was their practice, in fact, especially as late as the 14th century, to, well, some of these peoples had been obliterated during this century. We're not sure exactly, again, where the whole thing dates, even the newer part. But they had been fighting against more updated forces, so they relied on this sort of expedient, right? Captured weapons, however damaged. I made multiple videos about Lithuanian warfare. We will see something more dedicated to the Prussians, the Pomeranians, but I discussed them as well, right? But Baltic warfare is fascinating in its primitiveness, in fact, and in the survival, in fact, very archaic models, even up to late in time, including the same paganism for, albeit very convenient political reasons in the case of Lithuania, as you know. So at this point, Europe had more like albeit the Baltic area was the one where things were still being molded by the 13th to 14th century, politically and territorially and ethnically as well. The Polish Slavs were now provided with their own monarchy, with their own state, right? Doesn't matter how, say, lagging behind in part Western Europe. They had a strong identity also from a political point of view. They had been heavily at this point influenced by German military culture, under which they would remain essentially throughout their history. I made multiple videos about early modern Polish-Lithuanian warfare. We've seen how, especially certain elements of the Polish army were bought or modeled after German pools, German forces. The German influence in Polish culture is especially evident in the military field, right? Materially, terminologically, it is true that here we're talking German because this was the main culture influencing Poland, but we're talking at this point also for Germany and a process of gradual Frankization, Westernization, mostly that pool, let's say, of military update that was France and spreading across the rest of Europe, all right, but some other important areas, especially Mediterranean, basically at the same level of advancement. When we talk about Central Europe in this case, mostly following the pattern of Germany and any other people that had been east of that. The Scandinavians, in part, having been feudalized and westernized through the Christianization at the end of the Viking era, etc., but having already fit a bit that background already, especially compared with the much less developed Baltic peoples. So there are endless informations, data about this German influence. I will treat this better in some other video, but from an archaeological point of view, we can appreciate some examples of this. For example, there is a sword from Grzebsk in Czechenov, Mazovia, dating to the 12th century. I don't know where it is now. It may have been destroyed during World War II, but I'm not sure, honestly. It may have been lost, rather. And however, we know that probably this was a German bladed sword. And on it, it's inscribed in nomine, right? The reminder, the Latin inscription, however, being lost. This could have been in the name of God or whatever, but it would have been interested. Just we appreciate it because we realize there's an important German influence on the structure. But again, it was completely normal just from quite a long time. I mean, the same Vikings had been importing Frankish blades, etc. This was just the Upper Rhine, especially the major metallurgical productive area, as you know, from the migration era. I made some video about this already. We'll come back on it at some point. We have a sword from Ostrov Letniski, that is to say near Poznan, Great Poland. This is pretty old. It dates between the 10th and 11th century. It's preserved at the Museum of the First Piests in Letnica. And we have overall about, say, for Poland, really a lot of medieval swords found. Also from this early date, because these were pretty warlike cultures that were also Christianized fairly late, right? As we've seen, the Poles, right, Christianized fundamentally the turn of the millennium, but these other Western Slavic populations all around that fought against them were pagan, and as a consequence, they often, at least in their custom, practice some burial rituals that allowed the survival of many swords, unlike what happens after Christianization, where people are not buried in arms anymore, and so archaeologically we can't quite trace, if not from the various tombstones and art, rather than the actual pieces, right, of weaponry, the kind of characteristics. And most such swords still, in this pre-Christian context, from the 10th even to the 12th century, were still probably imported from Germany. Interestingly enough, and this, of course, Christianization occurred because the Germans conquered these people, and so you can see this as a Trojan horse of some sort. I mean, they were dependent, after all, and exposed to the German military maritime capacity, and so they would be eventually colonized by the same peoples from which they bought arms, and they were indebted themselves. And this sword could be actually one of those examples. We have a scabbard from Gdansk, Pomerania, dating to the 11th century. It's preserved in the local archaeological museum. The scabbard is wooden. It has a inner sleeve inside. The wall is covered by linen, by the way. This piece was found properly in Pomerania, which was ruled by the Poles from roughly the 80s of the 10th century to 1033. And after that, it was fundamentally independent until it was taken over by the Germans in the 12th and in the 13th century. Instead, so here a hybrid, who knows, who wielded this weapon at a time. We have a sword from Białystok that is in this sense in between Mazovia and Volhynia, right? So at the eastern frontier of Poland with Rus. This dates likely to the second half of the 12th century, and it's preserved at the Archaeological Museum of Warsaw. The sword is surely a Western import, right? But it is found this east, right, near to the Russian Principality. So we do not exactly know who brought it, whether it was a Polish guy or it had been imported in some way into the Rus, or maybe it belonged to a Teutonic knight who was roaming around fighting against a Prussian or a Lithuanian that may have even killed him and taken the sword at some point. So we have no idea. Again, especially if, as we've seen, these people the poor people tended to treasure these fine pieces that they would win as a prize of, as loot, as the spoil of war. Well, it becomes practically impossible at this point to determine once again who was actually using it. We have a coin from Prince Jacza of Köpenick. We are in Pomerania in the mid-12th century. This is preserved actually at the Zentralinstitut für Alte Geschichte und Archäologie in Berlin. Here the Prince Jacza seems to have been one of the last Slavic princes inhabiting the Berlin area, that, as you know, was, in fact, just everything east of the Elbe prior had been Slav. The same Lübeck that, as you know, would lead even the Hanseatic expansion as the first city, the founding city of the Hansa, and participating greatly in the especially logistical support and colonization of the Baltic, was built after the Slavs that had inhabited there had actually destroyed the first settlement. So you have this very intertwined history. The area of Berlin at this point was divided between the German Nordmark, that I still have to cover in my German regional series, and the independent Pomeranian by the mid-12th century. So even here, it's a frontier area. The same German lords are extremely similar in lifestyle to the Slavic ones, because they're poorer areas, so they are poorer aristocracies, and so they look pretty much alike. But of course, these other guys they marry into, etc. So again, we can't quite say. We know, however, the guy here specifically. So we don't know the origin specifically of this word, but we can see a strange mix of both sort of German and Eastern styles. For example, the spear and banner that he is wielding are apparently German, right? This coin may even, it's not entirely clear, of course, what is depicted in a life-like fashion, but let's say we could see here a large kite-shaped shield, but it is actually hung on his right arm, which should be the other way around. He also seems to wear stylized and or inaccurately rendered lamellar cuirass that, as you will see, was of course more likely to be found in the East as a design, and the Poles may have maintained for a longer time than we think. Consider that lamellar armor already continental Europe as such was more common in countries like Germany and Italy than, say, properly the narrower western part. So you understand how Poland could be easily influenced, like by the, say, Russian Byzantine styles as well, even though, again, it was mostly under German influence externally. We have the Schwerpunkt, that is the Polish coronation sword, dating to the second quarter of the 13th century. It's preserved at the Wawel Art Collection of Krakow, that was essentially the capital. The duchy had essentially the seniorate among the Piast duchies in Poland, a bit like Kiev for the Rus, right? And this is a magnificently decorated ceremonial sword that was likely made, considering the chronology, for Prince Bolesław of Mazovia and Sandomierz in Little Poland. We see it's very Western, right? By the mid-13th century, you realize that the structure is basically the same, what had been generalized for the peak of this point of European chivalry, right? We see, however, the blade provided with an unusual hole that today is actually covered by the shield bearing the Polish eagle, the white eagle with the red background, that, as you know, stemmed from the legend that the first Polish ruler would see, or say, where to settle. It's legend, right? But at sunset, right, where this eagle would, of course, like the symbol of the divine empire, would pose itself in the land that would have been Poland, and with the red sky and this intense white because of the sun rays arriving on the bird, and so hence the Polish national symbol, right? It's likely that this sword, especially this sort of ceremonial ones, but initially, like even the truly wielded ones in war had this at some point. I made a video on this. Would contain a sacred relic that was thought to confer, of course, more an extra power to the sword, right? A spiritual one, of course, required particular skills to be wielded and to be had in the first place, and so this fit properly for the Polish monarch. We have yet another sword from the later part of our period, the mid-14th century, from Lutold Mokry, that is in Gorzów, Pomerania, Brandenburg. This is also lost during the Second World War, and it belongs to an area that was still battled over by the Danes, the Germans, the Poles, right? When we look at Brandenburg, the same Pomerania, Great Poland, etc. So we can easily see that this is yet another German sword, hand and a half one. This was starting to become, say, at this point, actually double-handed swords, as you know, from the last decade of the 13th century were around, but the idea of bigger swords, not just a hand, but a hand and a half, were necessary to smash into the set of plate armor to try to disjoint them in some way. And the Germans, though, had been famous, especially in other countries like France, etc., for this 1.5 hand swords from earlier times, and part of the reason having to do likely with the less use of cavalry, at least in Germany, before it was deforested and sort of better colonized, which naturally means, say it's a weapon that you can use also on horseback, differently from double-handed swords, just on a regular basis. It may have had something with the size of people wielding it. I mean, the Scandinavians, after all, had their double-handed axes and so on, but it has mostly to do with this likely greater, say, terrain difficulty for which cavalry at some point had to dismount on a more regular basis. But by the mid 14th century, it's also likely because of the natural trend that swords were following now in order to be more effective, more performing against plate armor. If we make a step back looking at what made a characteristically Polish feature in local warfare, we can trace at least the development of the aforementioned armored cavalry elite in the 10th century, in parallel with the growth of Polish power over the other people. So people that evidently and obviously had derived their greater equipment from loot and raiding, subjugating other peoples. Albeit the majority of Polish horsemen would still fight in pretty traditional ways, which means very often without a proper armor, and or at least with a lighter type of protection, which was understandable given that they had less resources, but also they had to fight against pagan neighbors in the northeast that were even more likely armored when not unarmored. Like I also have scheduled for some time now a video about the Prussian tribesmen, so we'll see a bit. But say material poverty is a bit, especially at the beginning of the period, like the standard here. So it's already a huge deal for the Poles to have emerged in this prepotent fashion to affirm their own substantial power and to have it fixed in this way over the neighbors. So it's really fascinating. Speaking of Polish archery, well, you see, we do not have that much evidence in the first place. Of course, these were lighter missile forces that were less, just documented, appreciated, whatever. But we can imagine, of course, the average missile weapon in Poland to have been a simple bow or a long bow that surely remained there traditionally from the 10th to the 12th centuries, when crossbows eventually kicked in and would gradually replace this more traditional types of weapons. So actually, it's even wrong to say that there weren't crossbows in Poland, right? And or that they were simply imported from Germany or Scandinavia first. They had always existed around, but of course that came like with the whole pack of feudal system of Western arms and armor, sort of political compaction, and so it would spread more gradually in Poland, and of course also by the influence of these populations. We can see definitely an influence from the southeast corridor, say leading from to Poland from the steppes, right? And needless to say, there is a significant amount of Central Asian influence in these countries. We often miss how that is true, both genetically and materially, etc. That the steppes are there. Like Poland, together with the Rus, is just one of those countries that really borders that, and that would historically receive lots of influence from there. I made a video about the Lipka Tartars, about really a lot about steppe warfare. We've seen how the Balts, for example, were greatly influenced by that, even Scandinavia. So Poland is just out there, right? The steppes, that's what I say, begin with, let's say, when Germany ends, the steppes begin, right? This is not a racist statement or whatever, but it's true. Like, it's like saying Hungary and Italy, like the idea that the steppe, that the westernmost chunk of the steppe arrives literally next to Western Europe, and that's a completely different world further east, is true, right? Central Europe is also and particularly molded identically by this, right? In an unequal way. Let's say those who occupy the highlands and tend to be more sort of traditional, tribal, sedentary in some sort, but of course the elites are eager. Think about the Polish Sarmatism to adopt the same steppe rulers model, because it's dramatically anti-democratic in a much more ruthlessly violent way than anything that existed in the West. As you know, the Polish Szlachta would treat the Polish peasantry as barely subhuman beings throughout all their history. But there is a technical influence as well that cannot quite simply pass unseen, right? The Central Asian influence may have come, of course, through the same Kievan Rus, or even from Hungary, from different directions, let's say. Needless to say, the southeast of Poland was much more influenced by nomadic warfare than, say, Silesia, right? That was to become a piece of Germany, basically. So we can see this influence in the horse harness, some weapons. Elsewhere, 10th to 12th century, Polish military, of course, equipment was still, say, more Westerner, right? We can't say that, especially by the 15th century, there is really nothing about Polish warfare in outlook that looks something different from the rest of Western Europe, right? From the 16th to the 17th, we see definitely, especially with the further consolidation of the union with Lithuania, a much greater Easternization of warfare, like the famous Polish hussars, etc., are a product of that. It's a doctrinal problem, a political, strategical one, but also an anachronism of success, right? But this early, we definitely see some interesting blend there from, again, a quite recent sort of threat coming from the steppes, right? Of course, Poland belonging fully to that sedentary world that opposed the steppe, so that is not to say that they were so... Say, in the Rus there was a much more blurred divide, right? Poland is truly a central, not Eastern European country. Still today, you make the confusion because of the Cold War separation, but the proper separation is, say, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, etc. Those are Central European. Hungary, Central European. If you pass into Lithuania, of course, Russia, Ukraine, those are Easterners, right? It's a very different and it's a very deep and big difference, right? And in European culture, the very root of what we mean as the truest European identity, and it must forcibly be understood in its clarity, by the way. If one is still confused about that, it's because they don't know the history of these countries. In any case, as we were just observing with some example, most swords in Poland seem to have been imported from Germany, straight from there. It's not to say, as we've seen, that it was plenty of swords everywhere, but the general need of the Polish nobility to provide themselves with the most updated armament was, of course, met by this. Even the process of German colonization was favored by the Piasts because of, at that point, actually an anti-nobiliar function, founding sort of towns like markets, etc., would stamp the great landowners, but the latter could still basically do similar things on a smaller scale, of course, getting connected to this broader European market of weaponry. We see even some spearheads and other weapons surely having imported from Germany. However, arms such as long-hafted light axes, even scythes, helmets of the directly riveted form, were a specifically Slavic feature. These were sort of relics of the migration era conceptually, but they still would do, and in those contexts, and were very particular Slavic features. Speaking of Eastern influences, consider I explained this in a video made very early in time, the first days of Schwerpunkt, about plate armor, the spread from, in fact, the Polish-German border in the 13th century, the famous armor of St. Maurice, etc. Well, the Poles, as we've seen, were much less sort of developed than the Germans as a whole, and so we have all this immense German influence of plate armor spreading from the eastern border, and then in a few decades being present all over Europe, really. So it wasn't much Germany in itself that invented or produced it. In fact, however, they had the metal for rendering also this evidence more archaeologically traceable for us. But the Poles actually had very similar plate armor designs, except they were organic. There is a famous so-called Polish belt that is a light armor made of leather, other organic material, that was used also until very late during, say, the Polish revolutions of the 19th century, etc. Was a very distinctive national thing that seems to have stemmed from cavalry armor, and specifically the need to be protected all around your torso, your abdomen, as a matter of fact, by darts, likely coming from peoples like the steppe ones, where they had there was greater archery, etc. And the idea is that given that the first plate armor spread exactly with the same design around the abdomen, with this leather bases to which plates were of metal were attached, we think that that design was modeled by the Germans over Polish designs, and even way more Eastern ones, also because chronologically this overlaps with the Mongol invasions, where at Linitz, as you know, the German and Polish nobility was massacred by the Mongols, and so this makes something. Some finds are interesting. For example, a sword from Brześć Kujawski in Włocławek in Mazovia, dating to the 11th century. It's preserved at the in Warsaw, and it has for this chronology quite distinctively angled keyon, which may have been an Eastern European influence. On the blade you find the famous Ulfberth, indicating that the latter came from the Rhineland, right? Whether as a copy or, this was just the most famous brand, and that some others tried to steal it in some way and to resell it. So it's even more interesting that you find swords with markedly Eastern European, if not even more Eastern elements, but with blades mounted, again, imported up to there from Germany, from Western Europe. This is a dynamic we have seen also in the video about the Russian panoply for our Eurasian Steppes warfare series, in as much as you could easily find Western weapons in spite of the, say, classically, iconically Byzantine Romanization and sort of ancient style with which Russian art represented its saints, its martyrs, etc. But that archaeologically shows something else, a very interesting mix. After all, the Western steppes had been gradually and osmotically permeated by, for example, mail. That was by this time a more typically Western thing, even though it originally came from the steppes in the ancient world, but now, let's say, was being adopted, say, by the Khazars, by other groups that had been gradually sedentarizing once having settled in the early Middle Ages in those areas. So we shouldn't be that's the scale of these influences, and that's why it's important to visualize it correctly, not saying, well, that's an exception. No, it's not an exception. It's an exception for us to find stuff archaeologically, but this stuff tells us that, in fact, it was not an exception at all to have this kind of dynamics. We have a sword from the Odra River in Szczecin, Pomerania. We are between the mid-13th and the mid-14th century. It's preserved at the local National Museum. This is yet another German manufacture, at least almost certainly, because at this point, of course, the same Polish smiths were able to sort of replicate similar blades, to say the least, indistinguishably from the other Western European ones. However, this is still meaningful because in this time the area was part of the German Duchy of Slovenia, so-called, which tells you essentially the dynamic that happened. The Germans came as colonists, and that they would rule over the local Polish, Slavic at least, in fact, peasantry population. We have a spearhead from Busek in Zieracz, Great Poland, dating to the 11th century. It's preserved at the Archaeological and Ethnological Museum of Łódź. And this is a long pointed spear blade. It's very similar to the ones seen among the Baltic peoples, but it can be a coincidence to some degree. We have really a lot of spearheads, telling the truth, even dating from quite early in time for the aforementioned reasons. From the 11th century, we have very interesting catalogs. We see, for example, some influence from Gotlandic weapons, Baltic ones. We see a general promiscuity and similarity, especially as early as this, between Poland and neighboring peoples of any background, right? So, of course, the earlier you go in time, and the least you can characterize, distinguish. We have a spearhead from Łubówko in Poznań, Great Poland, dating to the same 11th century, preserved at the local Archaeological Museum Poznań. This is definitely very similar to some Scandinavian spears, right? The blades, particularly. We have axe heads as well. These weapons were surely proper of the local woodsmen, peasants, etc., that were, as we've seen, not very tender-hearted, right? It took a lot of struggle before a sound aristocracy finally bring them down, together with these other peripheral tribes still resisting. These axe heads have been found in the Lake Ledniki from Poznań, in, again, Great Poland. They date from between the 10th to the 12th century. These are preserved at Museum of the First PS in Legnica, and they probably reflect some pre-Christian ritual weapons burial of some sort. We see, as we were saying before, how these axes are typically Slavic. They differ from the Scandinavian Danish axe, given that their blades are thrust out from the haft as a sort of with a sort of an extended arm, right? They're sort of bearded, and as such, they are more similar to the Eastern European, but properly nomadic steppes models, right? They may at least have been derived from that. Yet they found, even if that is the origin of the design, to have spread consistently by the 12th century among many, not just Western but also Southern Slavic populations. And I think the reason of this is the fact that these areas, as we've seen, were less affluent in metals. There were more horsemen around, both locally and from the steppes, in proportion, that were less armored as such. And so even an angry peasant with one of these axes could have, say, chopped to pieces an unarmored horse. And that would have been the norm, telling you the truth, at least aside from caparisons, etc., pretty much in other places. But in fact, it could even mirror this greater, at least in the most tribal peripheral contexts, albeit, as we've seen, also the most primitive ones, the ones that had not Christianized yet, that still practiced this rituals, and therefore were not the leading powerful element of the population. Were just living at the outskirts of this greater, like for example the Polish power, would have reflected the fact that these individuals had greater personal liberty, and so it was just more difficult to find horsemen among them, and those that were there could be brought down to preserve more or less the social order, but not having on the longer run historically much greater luck with that sort of political social order, nor with their own independence, right? So again, the Poles were, for that reason, also developing this greater armored cavalry that finally managed to break this mold of otherwise tribally and mostly infantry-based Slavic warfare, as it was traditionally speaking, and or at least with consistent amount of, however, light horsemen. We have a bronze mace head from Gorzyce in Tarnów, Little Poland. We do not know exactly where dates could be between the 12th and 14th century. It's preserved at the Archaeological Museum of Poznań, and maces, especially of this design, are definitely Eastern influenced by some sort. They could have come from Hungary or the Hungarian-ruled Slovakia, Ruthenia, right? So a wide sort of southern area, particularly influenced by steppe warfare, and the most likely is again once dominated by the Hungarian state that I made a video on as well. You can confront it with this and the same, from the same series. We have a mace head from Szczepankowo, dating to the 12th to 13th century, from at least a catalog. I don't know where this piece is preserved, if it is still preserved, by the way, after the destructions. The Second World War Poland. And it's characterized by the knobbed rather than winged or flanged type, right? And this is yet another indicator of Eastern influence, right? We, of course, can think that there could have been easily just a local need to use such a weapon style in the first place. This particular mace seems to be bigger than the others, which are generally instead designed to injure lightly protected men, at least of this particular effect of that particular size, because otherwise it's always an anti-armor weapon. So this can mean that the Poles had sort of developed this type of mace that was maybe just common among them from this Eastern influence, but render it more effective against heavier type of targets, including their own, of course, knights and the ones of, say, more German ones, for example, to be more effective against armor, in fact. In any case, this specific mace design is also quite archaic in nature, so they still belong to a time in which heavy armor was sort of rare, as we've seen. And I will not digress on why in the steppes naturally these designs were, say, more useful in comparison, but again, you see here the modification, which is the most important one. We have a very late element, as late as the second half of the 14th century, even maybe 1400, that preserved at the Provincial Museum of Torun, that may have been from areas like Prussia or Kuyavia. Now, the interesting aspect of this helmet is the unusual form, there are some parallelisms with the bassinet that was developing in Europe, in Western Europe, but we realize that there are very similar designs in 13th century Ukraine to this, right? And so there could have been a mutation, especially in areas that doesn't matter how brought down by the Teutonic Knights, etc., may have still seen this sort of more archaic types of arms and armor because of the auxiliaries employed and the general sort of distance from civilization. It could have been essentially a development of this Ukrainian type of helmet. It's tall, pointed, with pendant aventail. We'll see now what the Great Polish helm typically really was, or something more distinctively Polish, right? This helmet, at this point, especially in history, may have even been provided with a visor, and it could be that this type of this specific helmet comes from some Lithuanian warrior. Maybe he had fished it in Ruthenia at that point, but we do not know better. Now, for something slightly more Polish, and so to understand also some characteristics from especially the earlier times, we can admire the helmet from Gorzuci in the region of Kalisz in Great Poland. It dates to the 10th, the 11th century. It's preserved at the National Museum of Krakow. This stems fundamentally from the Polish heartland, right? So the one that you would call the Great Polish style of armament that in fact stems from the Great Poland area. Essentially, this helmet consists of a gilded copper decoration on directly riveted iron segments, strengthened by an iron rim. This is very Eastern looking to some degree, and it tells you again how close really Poland was to, even as far as Middle Eastern influences through the Black Sea, the Caspian, especially during the Viking era, right? Just think of how close in practice these cultures were. This type of design would live on longer, by the way, in Eastern Europe, well after the Polish abandoned it, albeit it had been a kind of, not necessarily they're ethnically distinctive, but still sort of characteristic one in Central Europe. Also, okay, this could be found among other peoples, also in Bohemia, etc., but in general, like this specific style is essentially the Polish source of ultimately a Central Asian design, right? And was surely a former introduction of steppe invaders such as the Huns, even as early as that, the Avars, the Magyars. I like especially the Magyar connection there because it's really, there's even almost a Persian looking thing. And Hungary, the Magyars initially in their migration maintained this very important context even after they settled in Hungary with those areas because of the Silk Route that arrived at the mouth of the Danube and then rose up the river. So it's quite fascinating. We see another helmet from, we don't know whether it's Poland in this case, it's Central Eastern Europe from the 11th to the 12th century. It's preserved at the Merseyside County Museum of Liverpool, interestingly enough. It's magnificent, really. This is also called the Great Polish type, but just because it's similar again to the, in fact, Great Poland ones overall, but it could have been used by the Balts, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the Rusians, or even Balkan people, not just Poland, which is, however, still a possibility, right? And especially if it were from the 12th century, it would highlight how in these areas that still very archaic designs were preserved, right, due to the local conditions. we have a helmet from the Lake Letnikie, Poznan, Great Poland, dating to the 11th-12th century. It's the aforementioned Museum of Letnica. This was heavily damaged. The upper part, in fact, is being restored, and it's very similar actually to a Norman helmet, so a typically Western European one. The only, say, things that doesn't quite align with the aforementioned design is a hook at the base of the nozzle, right? And it's believed that this was supporting either an aventail or even part of a male hauberk to protect naturally the lower part of the face. It may have been used in Western Europe as well. We don't have to be so categorical to think that it was just an Eastern variation, but it is possible, right? Considering that aventails against the greater volume of arrows as a wall was sort of effective against, say, especially the nomadic archers. In Western Europe at that point you could have less things arriving at you but being a crossbow bolt, so later the helmet design would be sort of, as reinforcing the face. Of course this happened also in the steppes with some facial masks, etc. Finally, we can look at the Gideon. That is a silver bowl from Włocławek in Mazovia. I surely have butchered consistent part of these Polish names. This is preserved at the Archaeological Museum of Warsaw. It dates to the 11th century. And it's interesting because the bowl displays some figures. It's a metal work, right? And there is an interesting variety of arms and armor, right? That basically illustrates what like the Polish military styles could be as early as the 11th century. In fact, also considering the subject of this of the artistic representation, we're not in front of exotic pagan figures for which different arms and armor were usually represented. The helmets are relatively low domed, they don't have nozzles, and they seem to have male aventail, interestingly enough, rather than being worn over coif. This may be a way to represent the Great Polish type rather than the Western conical helmets that were around anyway. We see a short-sleeved male hauberk for one figure. One has instead long, close-fitting sleeves. This could actually even hint at a Byzantine or Islamic or steppes influence. Again, the lighter type is, as we've seen for the Byzantine chapter, like really being a thing, and also for practical reasons, say lack again of metal, right? Try to economize on the panoply. We could even think that instead this is an artistic license exactly inspired to Byzantine art, and for this reason being somehow unreliable, but it's still very plausible. Shields at this point are still round, different sizes, mostly medium, large. They are held through guige. There is also, however, a small round convex buckler with a large boss, and this specifically talks of some Slavic or even Eastern character of the same. So, as we were saying before, around the mid-12th century, the Polish state began to disintegrate into a series of petty principalities. In other words, as many times in history, this power had overstretched and broken down because there had, aside from this military impetus, not much of a basis other than looting the surrounding peoples to to really establish sound foundation for the polity. This was just obvious. The process of Western feudalization contributed to some degree, and so like this Polish magnates began to entrench themselves as they would do historically. In fact, as the main cause of this disintegration of the country in the 18th century. It's a very long time, but the dynamics were triggered from the Middle Ages, no doubt. Began to feel ever more again to imitate the Western feudalism for the prerogatives of the nobility, and so the general. You see, the Western national monarchies were already at this point sort of trying to build something out of that feudal glue into the form of a state. Central Europe hadn't had, up to that point, that feudalism. They were essentially tribes that had just reached this level of surplus enough to start feudalism. And so, while the Western European monarchies were compacting, the Central European ones were rather fragmenting, even though they were growing. In terms of political, military, and social force in the elements that constituted it. We see from the miniatures of a Polish manuscript dating to the 11th century, also dating to some collections because they are lost, likely because of World War II, some interesting heraldic patterns, proto-heraldic. Heraldry is a modern science rather than a medieval one, but they are obviously one of the most powerful indicators of this nobiliar dynastization and sort of lineages forming, also because of Germanic influence. If you look at the even name of the animals, the symbols, etc., they display a very clear and strong Western European influence. Right, the Poles were adopting military styles and feudal concepts associated with this heraldic symbolism, and it was again a way to distinguish themselves ever more from the masses, from the peasantry, this desperate effort, because they felt complex towards the other, better defined Western nobility. But they had this sort of more autocratic influence from the steppes that they wanted to imitate as well. So you have this very quick to learn and as ruthless establishment affirming itself at this point. From these other descriptions, because we missed the actual pieces they refer to archaeologically, there was a seal of an unnamed document dating to 1220. From Poland, and the guy on the seal displays an armor, right, with a coif, a hauberk, right. So even the seal itself, how it's styled, it's Western, right. We see a helmet, a spear, flat top, kite-shaped shield supported by a guiche. Again, very Western, very Frankish. Can argue. However, the way the coif is represented, that is of male, seems to contrast with the rest, the torso armor, which may have been perhaps scale or lamellar, right? And so it's albeit scale seems to be the most likely candidate for this particular iconography. Archaeologically speaking, we know that Poland had actually more lamellar, and this is fascinating because you have these styles being represented in different, the type of armor mixed in art and archaeology, and likely betraying the presence of all of them, of course, even in iconography, in spite of the artistic license. We have the seal of the Duke of Mazovia, dating to 1343. We're at the very end of the period, these last two examples. And they definitely provide us with an important information about Polish arms and armor from the period. the Duke carries a spear. We see behind the shield a straight sword with a large pommel, which was meant to handle the sword in more complex ways with both hands, right? We see, however, a pretty strikingly sleeveless lamellar cuirass. At this time, you do not find this in Europe. It's rather an Islamic, Mongol, post-Mongol, Eurasian steppes, Russian, or maybe Balkan. It was part of the Balkan type of armor, right? This is interesting because, again, by the 14th century, Poland is very Western in nature, but is still resented, given also the aforementioned expansion towards the southeast of these armor styles. And this, again, could depend on how the prince here wanted to be represented, whether he had this particular style or he wanted to be represented in the source, in the seal, like that. Though we don't know. We also see a rectangular shield, which is somehow strange for a guy of this rank. It's similar to the Bohemian pavise, and you could see smaller, more trapezoid shapes of shield in 15th century Hungary, Balkans, and Ottoman Empire, but even if there is a connection of these designs, there's something substantially different, right? Rather, we see similar shields on late 14th century memorials to Teutonic Knights in northern Poland, like of the 15th century type. So that could be a bridge of some sort, right? They usually had a bulge down the vertical axis. We do not know whether it was the Poles or the Slavs developing that. Let's say in general, or the Western Slavs, in general, say Slavic Europe, especially the one bordering with the steppes, had been developing this sort of pavises. The first ones are the Lithuanian in the interest of chronology, but the square type, the idea that you could use these sort of flat shields to form shield walls to parry nomadic archery. It is very typically of this crescent from the Balkans to northeastern Europe that had to cope with the heavy volume of horse archers, missiles. So there could be something about this. There could be something about the need for a Polish ruler at this point, especially when fighting against the Golden Horde that was around. Here we do not see it excessively, but consider that Poland had been invaded thrice by the Mongols. So definitely there was some increased need to restructure your armored forces, even in a way that was now coping, as we've seen, even with the Polish belt that was more original, with heavier volume of fire. Consider that crossbows were around, so in spite of the type of enemy, yes, it does make sense to have pavises around this time, even for, say, people think that pavises are just the camping tables that were moved as sort of, by the infantry as sort of mobile palisades, etc., but it's absolutely not true. The pavise is rather about its construction, at least in the most famous Italian type that spread basically all over the rest of Europe. That is due to not to the size, a bit maybe the squared shape, but mostly the fact that it was thicker, likely to some degree, and so it was better suited for parrying missiles, especially crossbow bolts. Right? So again, it's likely that the first half 14th century Polish panoply would, just like you see the Lithuanian pavise, that is a cavalry shield, in fact, around to have developed in this fashion, right? Even the Teutonic Knights may have had it for that reason. right? In fact, roughly square shields, but without, however, the keel-like bulge became popular among later 14th century German cavalrymen, in part surely because of this influence as well from the east rather than maybe from a local adaptation. Now, the Duke's lamellar cuirass in this seal itself is an evident Russian or Lithuanian influence. In Germany, you do not see anything like this. Again, you can see still up to this point some sort of lamellar, but not with this design, with this sleeveless. It's just ridiculous. I mean, ridiculously funny, but fascinating and beautiful with this. Consider that Mazovia is, of course, on the border with Lithuania, and at this time, the Grand Duchy Olgiera of Lithuania was essentially dominating the largest territorial dominion in Europe because of the Lithuanian swarming into Ruthenia. And after not even half a century later, this seal was made. Lithuania and Poland would unite, and of course there was a strong proximity, especially between these frontier regions. The Lithuanians were fighting against the Mongols in Eastern Europe. The Russians were too. So one could go as far as thinking that this was actually a Mongol type of equipment or something, again, hybrid with local traditions that, however, stem from Lithuania or even Mongol suzerainty on this duke, right? The Mongols didn't really extend this in spite of their gradual loss on the grip on Poland and on Ruthenia, etc. I mean, on Poland, on at least the capacity to invade in it. But they were very close, and they could easily invade. Like, there were lots of troops that, of course, were employed in this in-between, in this eastern frontier, right? So there wouldn't be anything strange here. Let's say the reception of a substantial influence in just even by fascination with Mongol warfare, with this power, with what the Lithuanians were doing as well, and everything kind of makes sense at this point. We have a bassinet from Tarnobrzeg, Sandomierz. We are in the southeastern part as well. This bassinet is said to have belonged even to Casimir the Great, right? So this helmet comes from Little Poland and dates to the mid-14th century. It's preserved in the treasury of the Wawel Cathedral in Krakow. So it's a very fine piece. And it's likely a Klappvisir type. I made some videos about German armor of the same period, and so you have this sort of mechanism that allows you to lower the visor, making it clasping with a mechanism the rest of the skull cap. And the specifics of this type is that of this specific helmet is that the visor was inched from the brow, right? Or was, at least in an earlier form of bretage, so a separate nasal or flap mail attached to the lower part of the eye-tail that could be hooked to the brow. And this also betrays some sort of Eastern influence conceptually, but it's also something you could find in Germany. So for similar practical solution reasons, so Poland is in between. There is nothing too strange at this point of substantially advanced arms and armor development just to find this mechanism shared at this level, at this regional proximity, right? There is a relatively small and very corroded brow attachment, suggesting a bretage rather than a hinged visor. There are similar Klappvisirs, or like the face masks or earlier helmets from Ruthenia that could have, in this sense, been bridge, which Poland could have the Polish types could have constituted a bridge of some sort, right? So again, similar solutions for similar problems, right? In not this enormous, say, geographical distance in the first place. Now, speaking of missile warfare, as we've seen from the 12th century, there is an increase in crossbows, which begin to replace the bow as the most important infantry missile weapon. Cavalry equipment at this point, especially the heavier one, we can trace better. We do not know for the medium and lighter cavalry becomes identical to that of Germany and Bohemia, for obvious reasons, like the Western influence was the strongest here. But we notice that the Poles are still a bit archaic, and likely because this equipment costs a lot, the panoplies were expensive, difficult to just compose fully, and there was a tendency to treasurization, saving this equipment for, say, passing it down the generation. We have also some still Eastern cavalry tactics, especially the lighter ones, hit and run, etc. So Poland is still with this level of ethnic shade, like protruding towards the east, both because of the Mongol invasions and the Polish expansion towards the southeast, and the gradual, say, influence also exercised over Lithuania and vice versa. There's a crossbow knot of horn from Tum, Płock, Mazovia. The smaller the thing, the more difficult to date, say from the 12th to the 14th century. Is it's preserved at the Institute for the History, Material Culture of Watch, and we see definitely in the 12th century an increase in the use of crossbow from Germany and Scandinavia. There were more or less advanced types. This one is somehow advanced. It's of horn. Instead, the previous release knots historically had been mostly of wood. We have arrowheads from Tum, Płock, Mazovia, 11th to the 13th century, the same museum, where there were really lots of these types, and we see different fashion, like socket types being the majority, like we would expect in a sedentary context. Of these, there were 3 barbed hunting or war arrows that are in fact very Western and Northern European. We find other types of bolts likely used for piercing armor as crossbow missiles. These are probably something developing later, right, say dating to the 13th century, and they're all very European, except you do find some tanked arrowheads, which are the typical nomadic horse archery variety of the Eurasian steppes. So definitely, if you're in Poland, that this comes from that direction without too much surprise. We find an interesting bow made of yew from Opole Brzeg in Silesia, dating to the 14th century. It's preserved at the local Piast Museum. Yew was the most common longbow material. Yet this is not really a longbow. It's 120 centimeters long. It's relatively short for being a long bow. It's very likely a hunting weapon, but it has this carefully carved ears, which may actually be some sort of Eastern nomadic influence. And of course, at the end of the day, what's the difference, especially at this age, between a hunting weapon and a war one? All right. Consider that every nobleman knew how to use a bow because they hunted with that, so they could hunt for, I don't know, peasants as well as animals, because there was literally no difference, according to them, between the two. So today we didn't focus too much on the Mongol invasions of Poland that instead represent one of the most impacting phenomenon in the history of the country. We know that Poland suffered dramatically from these invasions. We see in the generation after the first invasion, an entire new type of stone fortification affirming itself on some places that had been razed by the Mongols, and or just as a new type of fortification required, right, to defend themselves from these invasions that would repeat themselves. In this you can read not just a strategic need, but also the obvious increase in power of the nobility that with these invasions had obviously acquired much greater power over the peasantry that had been the one that would be more devastated by this phenomenon in the first place. So it's just a normal process of seigneurialization, we could say, that is quite typical of these critical moments. There is, of course, a broader Mongol problem also for the neighbors of Poland, we can say. The Baltic peoples, for example, did have a lot to do with the new changes of the new era in the later 13th and early 14th century. In the case of the Lithuanians, especially because they invaded Ruthenia, and they began essentially to share power as lords with the Mongols in the area, and so getting a lot, and also fighting actually against the Mongols themselves in pretty bloody engagements. Allied cavalry tactics were, in this sense, even more Easternized. This is very clear, especially in Lithuania, or at least what had become the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that of course encompassed more Ruthenians than Lithuanians at that point. And so, especially after the collapse of the Kievan Rus, this would, even in those places, see many former peasants like trying the military life as mercenaries in these neighboring powers that had the way of hiring them, plus these other steppes peoples inhabiting there. It's a similar process happening around the same years with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and also Hohenstaufen, Sicily. And during the 13th century, lots of the locals, with the collapse of the local structures, institutionally, politically, decided to become mercenaries, to serve abroad. So here the distances they're not so small, actually. Say, as I was saying before, if we're talking about fighting styles, etc., we realize that there is, let's say, the distances are not so big in the first place, but they are also, let's say, large enough to consider especially the nomadic lifestyle involved in this kind of expeditions. Right, there are lots of peoples of Turkic origins, for example, that had been fleeing the Mongol invasions, such as the Kumans that invaded. They were hosted as refugees in Hungary. Yes, in part they also invaded it in practice, but with the Poles, you know that many Tatars escaped Mongols, and so they came to be. They were settled mostly in Lithuania, but also in Poland, and so this helped, a bit like the Kumans, in Hungary, especially the royal cause against the ever more powerful nobility that the monarchy had not been able to tame, to ostracize, and they had to become to reduce power, say ostracizing is excessive, but these oligarchs could be countered with an army of foreigners that would be also, by the way, either pagan or Islamic at this point, and so could have not made it in the system if they had not been backed by the monarchy, and so they would be ever more loyal to them. This is a typical dynamic. So this all contributes, especially as far as the eastern part of, let's say better, there is the union between Lithuania and Poland. So mostly Poland is able to manage the system within Lithuania, and some of these peoples are settled also in Poland, but generally speaking, the latter remains more Westerner, undergoes a further Westernization, right? But it could rely, given that later on the Polish monarchy began to regain steam, especially in the 14th century, in a more unitary way, and with increased power as they came to rule in both Lithuania and Poland, a capacity to organize an army that was using all these elements from the various lands. So that's something that starts molding Polish armies as well, and Polish-Lithuanian armies in a very interesting direction. Mostly, of course, the troops you could levy locally were to serve locally, right? Or at least the Poles were not so eager to go fighting in Lithuania or in Ruthenia just per se. They took care of their Polish affairs, mostly the nobility, having the finest troops, of course, caring about that the most, right? Speaking of armor, we see more lamellar, that in fact is very much in common with the East, right? There is also a limited reintroduction of horse archery in the southeast of Poland that is very, let's say, undeveloped for even Polish standards, and that is very open to the steppe, very flat right then. And this could have, let's say, it's not characteristic of the whole country, but it may have began as early as the 14th century, in spite of the later re-Esternization of the Polish army in the early modern age. Nevertheless, what matters is that the Polish army consisted also of a large number of infantry. They are a bit an overlooked factor in Polish warfare. I made a video specifically about the heavy infantrymen of, say, 11th to 13th century Poland. That is more documented because of seals of this other stuff, but let's say would document, especially in such a stratified, vertically divided country like Poland, the peasant levies or the town militias or the woodsmen, but they were there, right? And they were there, especially in the 14th century, by a considerable degree, because, as you know, Poland was mostly spared from the Black Death for some strange reasons. Also, demographically speaking, you see a greater permanence compared to other countries in relative terms of this middle class. You can say that, of course, would never count too much in the country, but still was numerous to be relevant. For example, the army led by Władysław II in 1330 consisted, this is just a number of an army for all, of 2,100 heavily armored cavalry, 20,000 light cavalry, and some 30,000 infantry. Is this number possible? Well, it's probably and slightly exaggerated. I mean, 50,000 men, it's a bit too much. That this is an important expedition, but it's like not the norm. yes, it is possible that you could count them in this way, but you should understand also how much of this was an actually fighting force, which is often overlooked as a concept. But the proportion is fascinating because you see actually a relatively typical ratio of, let's say, there's nothing too typical about this, because the 2100 heavily armored cavalry would have historically corresponded to, especially at this point, to maybe a 5 times more infantry, like say 10,000 infantry. But you see much more actually. Plus this light cavalry component, which you do not even quite clearly understand, what kind of background it had, whether it were these knights retainers and or these horse archers from the east, maybe settled as communities somewhere, the populated area, especially of Lithuania or northeastern Poland, or the south, say the eastern part in general. And yet, right, this composite nature seems to suggest that there was a bridge, in spite of the most typically Polish Western outlook of especially the 15th century, between, in fact, the early sort of steppe influence in Poland and the later early modern restructuring, right, of the Polish military in that direction. So I think this is one of the most fascinating aspects, because it shows, after all, how let's say certain characteristics do remain standing. Even the large number of light cavalry not quite disappearing in feudal Poland, right, for a reason or another. Surely the composition changed. Surely at the beginning it was more Slavic raiders of some kind, were surely steppes elements already at that point. But later on, the average Pole going down in terms of personal liberty, very often this, because of the oligarchy and then the monarchy inviting this light horsemen from the steppes in the country and making good use of them, and at some point, however, still having a very composite country, as you understand, because even though the Polish monarchy recompacted, the country was still split on different bases, different duchies, different areas that still maintained their own autonomy, the traditions, and so on. Poland was very composite in that regard, and resenting really many different influences from many areas, right, from Germany, from Bohemia, from Hungary, from the Teutonic Order, from Transylvania, from Ruthenia, from Lithuania, from the Baltic sort of reminiscence at some point. So it's really one of those pictures that you can't quite simply frame in a absolute sense, in a sort of bulky, uniform, homogeneous dimension. You have always to look at the core of it, but also of all the other elements that would be co-opted depending on the situation, and trying to maintain especially this oligarchic power standing, because that's what mostly governed the country, and the monarchy just trying to erode that, hopefully at some point trying to win, but it would be a very long-term struggle that eventually ended in favor of the oligarchy, but to the detriment of the country, as a matter of fact. In any case, we will appreciate these things. We go on talking about Polish warfare, which I'm delighted to do, because it's always very interesting and often overlooked, and it has lots of distinctive and sort of extraordinary aspects in it. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.